Fantastic. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Welcome to the webinar from the Philanthropic Foundation's mechanism on crisis as a catalyst, how philanthropies can use global food security architecture to respond to shocks and strengthen resilience in food systems. So just to introduce myself before we begin, my name is Carlotta Kramer. I'm the focal point for the Philanthropic Foundation's mechanism, the PFM, to the Committee on World Food Security here in Rome. And I will be the moderator for this event today. So this is a very opportune and very critical moment to reinvest in food systems and in resilience, and to discuss the role of different stakeholders in order to do so. So I'm very excited to get started with the discussions today and make the best use of our hour that we have. Before I do so, I'll just share briefly a little bit about structure and some housekeeping comments. So firstly, about the structure, we will have two opening speakers setting the scene for us, and then we'll spend a good portion of the hour with an interactive panel discussion where our speakers will have the opportunity to answer questions from the audience. So please do share your questions. I'll pass to the opening speakers in a moment, but firstly, some housekeeping comments. Firstly, to say that we have interpretation, as you'll see from the chat, in Spanish, French, and English. If you'd like to turn on the interpretation, you should see at the bottom of your Zoom screen a globe icon. If you don't see it, it's under More. So please click on the globe and select the language that you would like for interpretation. There should also be instructions in the chat. There's also the possibility for closed captions. Again, that's at the bottom of the screen or under More in Zoom. And for any questions on the interpretation, on the closed captions, or on any technical issues, please reach out to Teresa in the chat and she will support us with any tech issues. So as mentioned, we'll have a very interactive discussion in the later part of the webinar today. And in order to do so, we would invite all of your questions in the Q&A box. So any questions that come up as our speakers are discussing, please share them through the Q&A and we will have the opportunity to address them later. And if it's applicable, please also share who your question is directed to, so that way we can make sure that they're answered as appropriately as possible. And please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat as we go as well, and feel free to have discussion in the chat too. So final note before I pass on is that the webinar is being recorded and will be shared with all registrants after the session. So without further ado, those are the housekeeping comments. I would like to introduce our first two opening speakers. Setting the theme for us today, we will have Ahmed Balim from the Gates Foundation. Ahmed is a senior program officer and leads multilateral engagement and global policy work with the Gates Foundation. He helps manage relationships with the World Bank, with the FAO, IFAD, the European Commission, as well as other development finance institutions. And of course, Gates Foundation is a member of the Philanthropic Foundation's mechanism. And then we have also with us today, Alison Blay-Palmer. Alison is the lead author of the report on building resilient food systems from the CFS's high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition. She's also a professor and UNESCO chair on food biodiversity and sustainability studies. So without further ado, Ahmed, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Carlotta. Hi, colleagues. Hi, participants. Just to frame and tee up today's conversation, I wanted to provide a little bit of context of how we've been approaching this, and frankly, from a very personal note, how I've been approaching this. We're in the midst of yet another fertilizer crisis. We're in the midst of perhaps the third or fourth food and price crisis of my relatively short career. Yet, we have a global system that isn't necessarily responding to the needs of the poorest and most vulnerable that are most impacted by these crises. And at the same time, we have a philanthropic community that is uniquely empowered to be able to bring together the various actors across this system. And the conversation today, we hope, should delve a little bit more into what is it that's unique about philanthropies as they engage this space. Let me set up sort of the construct of what are the other complements of the system. Member states of the multilateral system often bring sovereign authority, they bring domestic resources, but they're often constrained by political cycles and the tension between global and sometimes national priorities. Multilateral organizations often bring scale and country presence, but they can sometimes be slow in terms of getting resources out the door. Humanitarian actors, also sometimes in multilateral organizations, they move fast, but they're wired for relief, not development. And the opportunity cost of philanthropic capital going to humanitarian relief is also often very high. Philanthropies, us as a community, we bring something different to this conversation. We bring greater tolerance for risk. We often have speedier decision making. We have a unique convening power. And often we have the ability to fund things that no other actor is willing or able to do. So for us, often the question is not how do we scale our response as a community from philanthropies, but what uniquely changes if we engage. And as we make our own decisions internally across the various philanthropies that make up the philanthropic mechanism, that's a question that we're sort of fundamentally asking ourselves. The CFS ecosystem is a unique place where we're able to engage as a community, and its policy products, the relationships built through mechanisms like the Philanthropic Foundations mechanism, they are potentially an essential part of a crisis-ready infrastructure. So today, as we look at our panelists, as we engage deeper in this conversation, hopefully we can talk a little bit about what is catalytic about philanthropies in moments of crises. What are the financing instruments that unlock multiples of the original investment that we make? What are the convening roles where foundations, philanthropies can often be trusted intermediaries? And what are the signals that we can send to the multilateral system that can potentially bring others along, including donors? In each case for us, the value is often about being catalytic, not necessarily about the volume. It's about de-risking, it's about convening, it's about signaling. Philanthropies will never match ODA, dollar for dollar. And in this session, I hope we're able to delve deeper into the unique asset and role that we bring to this crisis and many more to come potentially. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ahmed. As the lead author on the HLP CFS report published last fall titled Building Resilient Food Systems, I'm very pleased to be here to provide some framing thoughts for the webinar. So thanks for having me and welcome everybody. The report Building Resilient Food Systems is grounded in principles of equity as the basis for resilience. And the rationale for this is simple. It's clear that there needs to be structural change to shift the food system towards resilience. However, it's also clear that unless this shift is grounded in equity, including the right to food, building capacity and agency for the most vulnerable, and supporting ecological integrity, will continue to reinforce business as usual. The concept of bouncing forward as a new idea is key to this idea of equitably transformative resilience. It is no longer enough to bounce back to a pre-crisis state as food system parameters are shifting and declining so rapidly. We need to do more than resist, absorb, adapt, recover, and prevent shocks and stresses. While these approaches are obviously crucial to understanding return to pre-disturbance conditions, they fall short of acknowledging and acting upon the historical and structural factors that make food systems, their components, and actors most vulnerable. Resilience, on the other hand, understood as the capacity to bounce forward, recognizes we need to support food system transformation towards a different state that enables agency and capacity and builds on socioeconomic and environmental interdependencies, so those synergies that we know about. This perspective acknowledges that without substantial change, food systems may even bounce back to what was a suboptimal situation given changing circumstances, making them more prone to shocks and stresses. However, by bouncing forward towards equitably transformative resilience, the direction of food system change nurtures equity and justice and the realization of human rights while remaining within planetary boundaries. The evidence as presented, through case studies in the report and the forthcoming repository of case studies confirms that by reducing underlying stresses, communities can respond meaningfully when shocks occur, improve livelihoods, be more food secure, and ensure planetary well-being for generations to come. This in turn minimizes coping strategies that would otherwise create long-term negative effects, such as selling assets, interrupting education, or compromising food security and nutrition. The policy convergence process for the report, under the excellent guidance of Ambassador Flores, is ongoing. During this process, CFS members, governments, civil society, private actors, and philanthropy interpret the evidence and design policy recommendations to make these concepts applicable in policy and in other actions. With the presentation of the recommendations and the report itself, equitably transformative resilience will have the underpinnings to be taken up by countries around the world. The report's concepts can contribute to broader discussions on resilience beyond the CFF. The pathway the report maps is relevant across scales, from communities to global organizations, including many UN bodies, and is inclusive of all sectors. In this way, it helps to lay out a clear roadmap for equitable transformation that addresses the needs of the most vulnerable. The report makes it clear that we can and need to build resilience now for future shocks and stresses. Thanks. Back to you, Carlotta.
Thank you very much, both to Ahmad and to Alison, for framing the discussions for us and for setting the scene and shaping the discussions. So I'd like to move on to the next section of our webinar, which is the open discussion interactive panel Q&A. And so we'll have 4 speakers, just to explain the structure a little bit. We will have 4 speakers who I will introduce in just a moment. And each will give a kind of opening response and a few opening comments. But beyond that, we would really like to have a discussion with the audience. So I invite again to the audience to put questions in the Q&A box, put questions in the through the Q&A so that we can pass those on to our speakers and have an open discussion. And please feel free to ask questions to any and all speakers, including to Alison and Ahmad from the opening section. And if you have a question for someone in particular, please mention who it's for, but otherwise we will pass the questions to all speakers to be able to respond to. So whilst I give people a chance to put their questions through the Q&A box and think about some questions, I'd like to introduce our panel for the Q&A. So we have 4 speakers with us today. We have Daniel Moss, who is co-director of the Agroecology Fund, which is also a member of the Philanthropic Foundations mechanism. Daniel has worked in philanthropy for over 3 decades, channeling resources to community-led organizations and collaborations, and is a trained community activist. We also have Ambassador Jennifer Mojica Flores. Ambassador Flores is the Ambassador of Colombia to the UN in the UN agencies in Rome. She's an expert in agrarian and environmental law and a human rights activist. And she's also the vice chair of the Committee on World Food Security, and is the rapporteur leading the process, the CFS policy process for the Building Resilient Food Systems policy recommendations. We also have with us today Farah Kabir, who is country director for ActionAid with ActionAid Bangladesh. And Farah is a long-term human rights activist and feminist. And our 4th speaker is Anna Ocampo. Anna is the Finance Partnerships Lead with the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty Support Mechanism. And her work is focused on better integrating financing for SDG 1 and SDG 2 in the framework of the Global Alliance. So these are our speakers, and we'd love to have, as I said, a interactive, open discussion. But I want to first propose a question to each of our speakers to get us started. So in order to do so, I will start with Daniel. Daniel, thinking about some of the discussion so far and the opening comments, how, in your perspective, can philanthropic responses build these bridges between global food systems governance institutions? Daniel, over to you.
Thank you so much, Carlotta. Pleasure to be here. Thanks to my panelists and to the audience joining us today. And a quick shout out to Alison and her team at HLP for a fantastic report on resilient food systems. And in fact, I think in preparation for just these brief comments I'll share, I read through that report again, really interesting. I recommend it to everybody here to take a look at it. And I think one of the things that was unusual and insightful about the report is the focus also on governance. We think about these kind of interventions, and I think governance, as is indicated in the report, is really a long-term way to move from crisis responses to really strengthening resilient food systems. In fact, to just quote briefly from the HLP report, it says that governance can build futures that support resilience or undermine it. Reforming governance structures in line with equity and participatory principles, guided by a systemic understanding of food systems, is an essential first step to achieving equitably transformative resilience. So philanthropy can invest in these strengthening civil society participation in governance institutions at the subnational, national, international levels, and in spaces like conferences of parties on climate change and biodiversity. In our experience at the Agroecology Fund, and I think in many colleagues, the Agroecology Fund itself is composed of 55 donors. And I think one of the practices that we have found amongst the foundations that are doing support to governance, to participatory governance within their portfolios is philanthropies can ask their grantees, what are the mechanisms and platforms through which civil society can advocate and play a role in food systems governance? And it makes sense to converse with grantees, a bit of an exchange, and then support them in amplifying their voice in the spaces they identify as strategic, whether it be at a municipal hearing or at an international climate deliberation. And in this sense, philanthropy can use grant-making resources in a few ways. One is to support national and subnational advocacy. I mean, and these could be kind of one-off campaigns on, say, a pesticide ban at the municipal level or moving subsidies into bio inputs at the national level. But more importantly, this also means supporting representative networks, farmer organizations, consumer organizations that have the power to represent grassroots perspectives. Philanthropy can also support global engagement in advocacy at these multilateral spaces like the COPs, like the Conference of Parties on, say, climate and biodiversity, and also in kind of alternative spaces like the People's Summit that just occurred in Belém next to the COP30 in Brazil. And then I think, other really important, and here we are, largely having this conversation around the Committee on World Food Security, is it's critically important for philanthropy to support mechanisms like the civil society and indigenous peoples mechanism, which, like the PFM, on which many of us participate in the philanthropic world, is a critically important mechanism in governance within the CFS. And the CSIPM in particular is a hard one place in which civil society participates actively. And we, as philanthropy, can fortify global food system governance through funding civil society participation in CSIPM, and importantly, funding CSIPM itself. And I think it's worth saying that CSIPM bases its work on rights-based frameworks, and those rights-based frameworks, such as the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People and the Rights of Peasants, come out of this kind of grassroots level advocacy. So I think the declarations themselves are the fruit of civil society advancing its voice in global advocacy. So I just want to stop there for my initial comments to say that emphasis on governance is something that the philanthropic sector can be particularly useful in. Thank you.
Very much, Daniel, and particularly for bringing the perspective of civil society engagement in governance institutions as well. I would like to turn next to Anna for some brief kind of opening thoughts. Anna, how can stronger multi-stakeholder collaboration support these faster crisis responses and the resilience building responses through the global food systems architecture?
Thank you very much, Carlota. It's a pleasure to be here. So first of all, the high-level panel on food security and nutrition, I think, rightly points out at the overlaps between acute and chronic food insecurity on the one side. It also draws our attention at the interconnectedness between food insecurity and inequity and inequality. This, and the report does that very well, by the way, this calls for an increase in the investments in the public policies that can transform food systems while addressing inequity. For instance, by expanding access to social protection for rural populations, by linking social protection with access to extension services and so on. Through the Global Alliances has been an effort to identify the policies and the solutions that play a role in addressing these issues. Many of these solutions are promoted by philanthropies or even came about through the catalytic support that philanthropies provide. But today the challenge is no longer to identify what works, it's rather scaling up and financing these solutions. This requires political will on the one side to prioritize policies that fight against poverty and hunger, but also greater investments and in the current development financing landscape, greater convergence between partners, because the sector is very fragmented and we are losing efficiency in the way that resources are flowing towards food systems. This fragmentation occurs between partners, among sectors, and within sectors. So as part of the Global Alliance, one of the commitments of the 215 plus members of the Alliance is to not only mobilize more resources for SDG 1 and 2, but also better integrate financing. So we are working on framework mechanism that could bring financing together behind these public policies or the scale up of these public policies. And there is a role which is central to play for philanthropies coming in with their particularities, their strengths, but in a way that aligns with these public policies. I will stop here. I know you wanted brief remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, and great to hear about the finance mechanism as well. I will next pass to Farah. To the end of building resilience in food systems, how can this additive role of philanthropy that we've heard a few speakers so far mention, how can this additive role be institutionalized through the way that philanthropy works with partners such as yours? Thank you.
Thank you, Carlotta, for having me. And I know I'm joining this webinar today when millions of people in Bangladesh are flooded. And the first crisis that occurs is water and food shortage. And that backdrop. So when I was looking at what's been happening even globally, like the Strait of Hormuz was closed earlier this year, the world did not suddenly run out of food, but millions of people immediately faced higher prices, shortages, and insecurity. And this continues as our food system has become dangerously dependent. We have built a system where disruption thousands of kilometers away can determine what the family will eat. You know, our farmers are not getting the fuel, and diesel is impacting on agriculture. So this is one level. And another level is the whole climate crisis and how it's impacting. And Bangladesh, being a delta, is in the front line of this climate crisis. Now, your question about how philanthropy can help is, you know, it must move from funding relief to funding resilience. You know, governments often don't have the flexibility. In fact, it's the huge machinery that finds it very difficult to move. Markets would have a tendency to, invest where returns are predictable. But philanthropy has a different comparative advantage. It can take risks. It can invest patiently. It can also support innovation that others consider to be local, too experimental, or too small. So the greatest contribution is not about replacing governments, but making it possible for governments, markets, civil society, communities to become resilient. Secondly, philanthropists should finance institutions and move out from the project modality. Projects are important, but long-term financing would be useful and shape institutions. They can work with programs like community seed banks, community food banks. Our experience has been working with women farmers and youth-led disaster response teams, and we've seen how effective those are. These are not just development projects; they are basically resilience institution building. They help communities to anticipate shocks, absorb crises, and recover faster. So it is one with the strongest local institution that I can think of. And I would say philanthropists, thirdly, or most importantly, must move from just delivering aid to shifting power. We have to ask the critical questions, which is, who receives the food? And then who owns the seed? Who decides what is planted? Who manages the community food reserves? And who has the voice when policies are made? Like countries like ours, there's no dearth of policies, but we need to be there. They need to, the communities and the women and the marginalized have to be there. Resilience grows when communities control the decisions that they shape. And in Bangladesh, that's exactly what we have seen through our work at ActionAid. In climate resilient local varieties. Community managed food banks ensure food remain available during floods and cyclones. Women farmers are practicing agroecology that restores soil while strengthening livelihoods. And young people are leading local emergency preparedness alongside local government. And these are very effective. So one lesson that stands out is the community is not just a recipient. They're not victims. They have agency and they can be the producer of resilience. And so I believe that implications of global food security architecture, like global institution matter, global financing matters, global cooperation matters, but none of these can substitute locally governed systems capable of withstanding shocks. You know, the community is the first responder. And so I really feel that we need to ask ourselves that food security is not ultimately about moving more food across borders. It's about ensuring every community can withstand the day those borders stop moving food. So philanthropy can play a big role. What we have seen is nationally, philanthropies are move fast in an emergency and globally also. But we have to discuss that some of these are structural and institutional problems. And here, if we want to have less dependency and replace it with efficient systems across the world, then we need communities to produce, govern, and protect their own resilience. So yeah, this is my short intervention. I'm open to conversations, but one thing I've always emphasized, there is a gender dimension to all these crises, and resilience. If you look at resilience, that also has a very strong gender dimension. It's been the women who are, first responders who are able to absorb a lot of the shock. So any kind of change, redesign that we may propose must be gender sensitive, gender responsive, and inclusive.
Thank you very much, Farah, and particularly for mentioning the floods in Bangladesh and bringing this discussion, this conversation into very real examples of resilience and of where resilience is needed. So thank you for that. And as you say, I hope we can dive into some of these points that you mentioned through the questions as well. To round out the first round of questions, then I will just pass to Ambassador Flores. So Ambassador, as in your role as the rapporteur and the CFS vice chair, what does multi-stakeholder, multilateral collaboration look like when it's working best?
Hablaré en español. Muchas gracias por la invitación y creo que es muy gratificante escucharles, sobre todo después de las últimas semanas de discusiones en el Comité de Seguridad Alimentaria sobre el documento de resiliencia. Bueno, creo que el Comité de Seguridad Alimentaria ocupa un lugar muy especial y único dentro del sistema multilateral, único realmente. Tras la reforma de 2009, al haber introducido a los 3 mecanismos, sociedad civil, sector privado y filantropía. Y su fortaleza radica precisamente en haber construido a lo largo de estos años una gobernanza íntegra que incluye ciencia, ¿no? Unas discusiones basadas en la ciencia, pero también evidencia con unas experiencias de los territorios que se incorporan a través de los diversos mecanismos de la arquitectura del Comité de Seguridad Alimentaria, también la participación inclusiva con las voces que tienen los 3 mecanismos y que tiene también el grupo de expertos, el HLPI, sobre estas discusiones previas que son la base de nuestras negociaciones y finalmente la negociación política. Y precisamente cuando alguno de estos pilares pierde fuerza o se desbalancea, el comité corre también el riesgo de perder frente a esta característica que lo hace único. Durante las negociaciones de resiliencia quedó en evidencia un desafío enorme. Estamos en un momento histórico en el que hay múltiples crisis, crisis climáticas, conflictos, degradación ambiental, desigualdad, pobreza, perturbaciones económicas que afectan simultáneamente la seguridad alimentaria de millones de personas alrededor del mundo. Y precisamente cuando el mundo necesita mayor nivel de cooperación, resulta cada vez más difícil construir consensos multilaterales. Esta realidad trasciende el documento. Yo lo decía, no haber llegado a un consenso el viernes pasado no habla mal de nuestro mecanismo, ni de la discusión que adelantamos, ni del año anterior en el que el HLP y Allison lideró este proceso tan maravilloso que fue el documento de resiliencia, ni de los 6 meses que llevamos trabajando abiertamente y de manera infatigable en esto. Lo que pasa es que la realidad trasciende el documento y estamos hablando de superar las causas de las desigualdades, esas causas profundas, y estamos ante una fotografía que no le gusta ver a los gobiernos. Y es ahí donde tiene mayor sentido este mecanismo. Los roles que comparte sociedad civil, sector privado, pueblos, con los pueblos indígenas que hacen parte de sociedad civil y con la filantropía, de hacer un proceso transparente, inclusivo, que está basado en la ciencia, que además cuenta con información y evidencia, que pone las discusiones en el punto central, enfoque de género, enfoque transformador, enfoque de igualdad, de superación de pobreza, el tema de cambio climático, la agroecología, es la médula de esta discusión. Creo que es lo más valioso. Creo que estamos en un momento crítico del sistema multilateral y creo profundamente, después de haberlo visto todo, de que el valor del Comité de Seguridad Alimentaria reside en este carácter mixto y que el futuro del multilateralismo tendrá que aprender mucho más de este mecanismo.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and particularly for bringing us in connection with the negotiations and the building resilient food systems process through the CFS as well. So thank you to all of our speakers for giving some initial reflections on the questions. We've got now some questions in the Q&A from the audience. So I will start bringing those to our speakers. I think the first question that I can bring to the speakers, and perhaps this anyone feel free to answer, but perhaps this is mostly directed to Daniel or Ahmad, our speakers from philanthropic organizations. So we have a question. In a context where a few private actors wield increasing influence over global food systems, how can philanthropy avoid reinforcing this concentration of economic, technological, and decision-making power?
I'm happy to kick it off, and over to you, Daniel. Most of the philanthropies in the Philanthropic Foundations mechanism work directly with nonprofit organizations. Our grants are principally to nonprofit institutions, period. We're not privileging particular large corporate interests in our grant making. We are private charitable foundations by law in the way that we're structured in our home geographies. So that's a fundamental way or approach that we have to work given our legal structures. I think thinking about this from a, let's say, strategic perspective, the best way that we could do this is to have our work be closer to those that are impacted or effective. And for, I think, most of us, that is the direction that we're moving towards if we're not there already. And that is the perspective that we ordinarily privilege. Over to you, Daniel.
Great. Thank you so much, Ahmad. Yeah, and maybe just a couple of quick things. I think, yeah, maybe what you said about getting close to communities, just the way that we do it to try to make sure that our resources are getting down to the community level as close as possible is to have our own governance system within the Agroecology Fund that's really composed of people that are close to those movements and networks. So for our global fund giving, the portfolios are advised by global advisors that are embedded in agroecology networks and movements. Similarly, we have regional funds in Mexico, East Africa, West Africa, and India, and the governance systems are the same. So we're looking for a situation in which the donors, the philanthropic community, can put up its resources, but not control alone the destination of those funds, but rather they're advised by communities that are going to recognize the important power in scaling, in building resilience from the community level. Thank you.
Can I also add to this? I think it's important when we talk about nonprofits or we talk about reaching out to the community, whatever we may say, women-headed organization, youth-led organization, indigenous organization are still at a disadvantage. It may not be intentional, but it comes down to capacity, it comes down to compliance, and it comes down to them not being visible in this ecosystem. So that is something that we can take up and in terms of global food security architecture and response. So we have to shift from the present system, like not charity and not looking at unfundable, or yes, there are risks, so we can talk about de-risking, but empowering women, youth, indigenous communities to take charge is important when it comes to the philanthropic landscape.
Thank you very much for those reflections. And Farah, we have an additional question also for you directly. The question from the audience is, can you give some examples of community food resilience and how policy and funding can support these efforts? So what particularly would be your key recommendations in this moment of the deepening global fertilizer crisis and potential food price rises? So some examples of community food resilience that you see in your work.
So in our work, because we are prone to floods and cyclones or tornadoes, as depending on where you are coming from, we have been working with the community, and what we understood was seed banks was very important because when the water recedes, they can replant. Secondly, indigenous varieties were critical for keeping the food system going instead of bringing in something from external. Moving beyond the emergency period, these are important. Water sources are critical, having access to water, and this is where we have worked closely with communities to make sure that they have access to water bodies, purifying them, trying to do rainwater harvesting. Even we're creating towers, pop towers, where it captures the water from the atmosphere. So access to water is also part of the food security. Those are some of the examples. Policies in many countries, for instance, in my country, are not necessarily coordinated in terms of the agencies that deliver, and there's also problems of lack of understanding, because you can't have a one-size-fits-all. Bangladesh is a country where you have coastal areas, you have the Sundarbans, you have dry areas. So we need multiple policies and approaches to address this, because there's serious salinity intrusion at the moment. And it's a big challenge for us working in the southern parts and coastal parts of the country. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Farah, for those examples. We have a question from the audience as well that I think speaks to some of the points that you were raising about the inclusion and visibility of women's organizations, of youth. So the question from the Q&A is perhaps can again maybe directed to Daniel, to Ahmad, but I think it would be great to hear from everyone on this question as well. The question is, how can the PFM directly support peasant organizations, indigenous peoples, rural women's organizations, groups who are often the first to respond to crises, but also often the last to access funding? I'd invite all of our speakers who are relevant to share on this. But please go ahead, Daniel.
Great. Yeah, no, I think, yeah, critically, I mean, that's kind of the DNA, let's call it the theory of change of the Agroecology Fund, is that, if we're interested in resilient food systems based in agroecology, which we really believe is the most resilient way to move food systems towards resilience. We have to support the grassroots actors that are building the knowledge, sharing the knowledge, experimenting at the farm level, working with their neighbors to introduce practices or reinforce practices, reinforcing their cultures, meeting and advocating with their elected officials. All that work really doesn't make there's no way to do it without providing resources to the grassroots organizations that form kind of the texture of the expression of communities. So, I mean, I think it really comes down to a question of a commitment on the part of the funding organization. Unfortunately, a lot of funding organizations don't, they don't take the time to really get to know the work at the community level. Perhaps they lack the resources, perhaps they favor international NGOs, perhaps they favor international research institutes, perhaps they have their own kind of technology that they're trying to introduce. But I think really the most fair way and the way that we can guarantee it is to provide resources directly. And it is a challenge. It is a challenge. There's a lot of informal associations, cooperatives, groups, organizations that may not meet the formal due diligence requirements of foundations. But I think it's incumbent upon us to kind of bend over backwards and make sure that we can extend resources to those communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And I'd like to open that question also to our other speakers and even kind of taking the question to how global food systems governance infrastructure architecture can support the participation and the visibility and involvement of women's organizations, indigenous peoples, and peasant organizations. So please go ahead, Anna. I saw you had your hand up.
Yes, I wanted to react at least to part of this question. No, I think a critical role of philanthropies is not only to support, and rightly so, no? So the grassroots organizations for sure. But then another key, if we want inclusion at scale, if we want the most disadvantaged communities and segments of communities to have access to services, to fulfill their right to food, among other of their basic rights, it is also about strengthening governments' ability to implement their policies at scale, to have inclusive and efficient social services that reach the last mile. So there is a role, a dual, or maybe multiple even role for philanthropies, not only to strengthen the grassroots and the most local level institutions, but also influence national policies and support by coming together. Support these national policies and government institutions and influencing government, the way that governments implement these policies and implement their services in a way that is effective and inclusive for all. So there is also this value in coming together, finding the very specific entry points for philanthropies, but in ways that are going to have this impact at scale, really, right? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Sarah, I see your hand up.
Yes, I was also thinking that, we have to look at the picture, a full picture, and philanthropic organizations may have particular agenda and work on it. But if you're going to address the food insecurity, there's a multidimensional and intersectional aspect to it. Now, if I were to speak about food security, I would look at also what is happening with adolescents and young girls. And if a young girl is married off at 14 and then she becomes a mother at 15, she herself has not developed physically or mentally, and there is intergenerational nutrition deficiency, and she's passing it on to the child that she's giving birth to, and she may be already in a precarious situation where this is happening. So if philanthropists are looking at supporting food security, they have to look at all the different dimensions. It may not be possible for one philanthropy to do so, but if they can bring together, have a platform and have this conversation that we are going into a community or a country and we're going to try and do a much more holistic approach to it. What we find is the left hand doesn't talk to the right hand. We have got the UN agencies supporting our governments and our institutions. Wonderful. And then we have different charities and development practitioners, donors working on other aspects, and they're segmented. So going forward, there's a lot of fund shrinkage, and B, the crisis is getting multiple. And now we have also seen how certain countries have withdrawn from 30% of their or 40% of their climate change support funds. And even the World Bank has withdrawn 30% of their climate program funds. The climate crisis is not over. And so it's an existentialist question and situation. So again, this has implication on the food security and resilience if we are going to have that conversation. Sometimes it makes me think that communities are so resilient, that's why they're still there. And this is a curse on them. Unfortunately, I hope that it's not a curse, but it's seen as a positive, and it is totally backed with not just the finances, but the political will and the commitment across board.
Thank you very much, Farah. Daniel, I'll pass to you, and then we'll take another question from the audience as well.
Thank you. No, just a quick, I think, when there are things that are happening that are a result of collaboration between government and civil society to guide both types of interventions at the public level and at the private philanthropic level, things like agroecology, national agroecology plans or municipal agroecology plans. There's an example where you have the cooperating parties. And I think it's, philanthropy is notably unaccountable, but when philanthropy can enter into a framework that has been debated and ratified, by at least by civil society and government, I think that's the best situation. And there are those kind of instances, and I think that we can really put ourselves into that framework. And I think that the HLP report on resilient food systems really points us in that direction, that we can be on a cooperating framework around the principles of agroecology. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, Ambassador Flores.
Sí, porque tengo muy presente lo que está ocurriendo en el Comité de Seguridad Alimentaria y obviamente no quisiera meterme a definir las prioridades de la filantropía porque respeto y comprendo la independencia, pero sí desde la perspectiva que veo y bueno, creo que no sé si ustedes saben que yo estoy próxima ya a dejar mi misión como embajadora de Colombia porque este cambio de gobierno pues va hacia un rumbo en el que yo no comparto. Yo he sido una experta y he trabajado toda mi vida en la promoción de los derechos de las comunidades, pueblos indígenas, campesinos, mujeres, en la construcción de paz en mi país. Y el gobierno que empieza ahora el próximo mes es un gobierno que viene con una agenda negacionista y regresiva y que no comparto, pero seguiré con mi responsabilidad al frente de la relatoría de este documento de resiliencia como me ha sido confiado y tenemos que pensar hacia adelante qué sigue. Yo creo que alinear las iniciativas filantrópicas con los instrumentos y recomendaciones del Comité de Seguridad Alimentaria, apoyar la implementación de lo que ya ha sido negociado y ganado y fortalecer la puesta en práctica y las capacidades locales en los países directamente, por ejemplo, en este caso como género, desigualdades, agroecología, directamente en las comunidades es un camino en el que no se puede retroceder ante un mundo en el que hay tantos desafíos y debates que incluso pueden ser regresivos. Seguir en la marcha, en la implementación y en la acción es un rol que la filantropía puede hacer y en el que es más que una gran fuente monetaria, es una palanca, ¿no? Dice que dame una palanca para mover el mundo y esto es algo que la filantropía tiene hoy una responsabilidad vital, pienso yo, en todo el trabajo tan fuerte que hace como parte de este mecanismo. También el Comité de Seguridad Alimentaria está siendo desfinanciado y creo que no es un secreto que la participación de múltiples actores no es cómodo. para muchas de las delegaciones y inclusive de algunos de los directivos de las agencias de Roma. Entonces, defender también este valioso instrumento único es algo que vale totalmente la pena. Estamos a puertas hoy de un comité de seguridad alimentaria que está a punto de paralizarse en sus procesos. No tenemos cómo financiar el año entrante el documento sobre conocimiento y sistema de conocimiento propio agroalimentarios de los pueblos indígenas. Estamos en un momento de inflexión donde hay cambios frente al reconocimiento de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas también. Estamos en un punto donde incluso el lenguaje acordado previamente está también queriendo ser renegociado y no en un sentido muy creativo. Entonces, mantener la vigencia hoy y la prioridad de política pública de la resiliencia es algo desde lo cual ustedes seguramente van a tener múltiples estrategias y mecanismos para incidir positivamente.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for bringing that discussion in, and I think also speaks to a question that was placed in the chat around some of the kind of challenges to agreed language in the negotiations last week, and thank you again for your work in guiding those. I think we're coming up to our time, so I think we have maybe time for just one quick last question that I would like to end with, and maybe very, very quick last reflections. But a question particularly also to Ambassador. And I'm kind of joining two questions that we have because I want to cover as much as possible. But looking forwards to the future as we finish this discussion, we have a question about the link between CFS processes and the role of philanthropy, particularly recognizing this challenge of kind of equitable participation, that not all stakeholders in the CFS arrive with the same resources and have the same capacity to influence or shape the consensus of the CFS. So if I could put the question particularly to the ambassador, but anyone else to jump in very quickly if we have a moment, on how how we can support that multi-stakeholder equitable participation of different stakeholders, and particularly joining with another question in the chat, just that there's a mention from a different audience member around governments kind of putting in place policies that crack down on civil society organizations and civil society participation. So how can we, philanthropy and the CFS, sort of work together to create more inclusive participation and thinking towards the future of the CFS? Very, very brief last reflections, if you may, and then I will pass over for our closing comments. Thank you.
Bueno, yo tengo como 5 ideas de ese vínculo entre los procesos del Comité de Seguridad Alimentaria y la filantropía. Uno, este carácter intergubernamental, participativo e inclusivo requiere fortalecer capacidades de los actores de los sistemas agroalimentarios. Ese es un rol o un link que veo muy importante. 2, favorecer las alianzas y complementariedades con los estados, agencias del sistema de Naciones Unidas y otros actores del comité. Esos diálogos no formales, complementarios, que generen un clima, ¿no? Un hábitat, un ecosistema, hablando de resiliencia, que sea sostenible para el ejercicio de la gobernanza y la coherencia de política es fundamental, más allá de las sesiones en sí mismas formales de discusión de política. 3, la financiación de bienes públicos globales como la investigación independiente, los datos, la generación de evidencia. O sea, las comunidades, si escucho hablar a Farah, a Daniel, a todos, las comunidades tienen toda esta sabiduría, conocimiento, experiencia, soluciones basadas en la naturaleza, un largo etcétera de conocimiento no sistémico, no sistematizado que no llega a los tomadores de decisiones. 4, promover la participación significativa de los grupos más afectados por la inseguridad alimentaria. Yo creo que de todo el trabajo y horas que estuvimos haciendo en este proceso de discusión de convergencia de resiliencia, los momentos más valiosos fueron cuando las partes, la sociedad civil, los delegados de distintos lugares del mundo vinieron con la contundencia de sus testimonios y el enriquecimiento de estos debates. Y 5, garantizar también esta transparencia, rendición de cuentas. Pienso que esa voz que de pronto es un poco incómoda para los estados, de los participantes y de los tres mecanismos es una voz hoy más que nunca necesaria.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Those five reflections were, I think, a fantastic place to close us. I'm feel like we're in the middle of the discussion, but unfortunately, it's all that we have time for today. So, without further ado, I'll pass to Mateus from the Global Alliance for some very quick closing remarks. Mateus is a senior advisor for the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Carlota. And first of all, what an excellent discussion. Thanks for everyone who joined us today. I think we really had some great opportunity to go deep into some of the critical issues, some of the tensions as well that we as philanthropic organizations face in engaging in global food debates. And I think also one of the key messages that came across in multiple situations during this conversation is that really the short-term responses will not fix the sources of our food systems problems. We can keep reacting crisis after crisis after crisis, but if you don't really address the structural vulnerabilities, the structural inequalities of our food systems, will keep coming back to the same point. The crises that we are seeing, there are not more really occasional disruptions, right? They are really becoming the norm. I'm also working with the Philanthropic Foundations mechanism for the past 4 years. And during this very short period of time, we saw COVID, the aggression wars in Ukraine, Palestine, Iran, the disruption of the Strait of Hormuz, which actually was the instigator of this conversation, which opened us the possibility for having those conversations. And now we're also observing the expected impacts of the El Nino, which everybody's talking about. So it's really a pattern. It's not something that will become occasional, but it's really a pattern, and it really demands a different kind of response. So we really need to shift this our thinking towards the long-term resilience that was addressed in the high-level panel of experts report. This idea of bouncing back that report indicated, I think, is really proliferous. And I really like what Farah said. We need to move our own funding from relief to funding resilience. This is really good. I think it really clarifies a bit the direction of our thinking, where we could make a contribution as philanthropy. So what is then our role as philanthropic organizations? I think we heard and discussed many possible avenues. We discussed, for example, the role of catalyzing innovation, also supporting social mobilization, supporting food movements, supporting civil society engagement with governments in developing policies, in implementing policies, in monitoring policies. And trying to be very concrete, I really think that we are facing serious difficulties in the multilateral processes. I think that's not a secret for anyone. But the negotiations that are ongoing, the negotiations that the CFS holds, they are really spaces where philanthropic organizations can add value. We can support those public institutions. We can accelerate the implementation of some of the CFS policy products. And we can also engage with other organizations, such as the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty's emerging financial mechanism, because it really offers opportunities for us to align philanthropic capital with country-owned, evidence-based resilience strategies. So before I close, huge thanks for all the interpreters who made this conversation possible in English, Spanish, and French. Special thanks to you, Carlota, for the excellent moderation, and also for Teresa, who has worked in the background, making sure that everything worked so smoothly. If you'd like to learn more about the Philanthropic Foundation's mechanisms, there's our website in the chat, and also an invitation. There will be a CFS plenary meeting taking place this October from 19 to the 23rd of October in Rome. If you'd like to be part of this conversation, it's possible. Reach out to us, reach out to the CFS Secretariat. We would love to help you how to engage into those. Thank you again, and take care, everyone. Thanks.